There's amazing news coming out of the Middle East. And I mentioned this to you yesterday, and I said, keep an eye on this. This is a story that I think is probably one of the most underreported stories in the United States because it doesn't lend itself to bumper stickerness. There are layers of complexity to this, and some of them require a certain understanding of what's going on in the Middle East. And I saw a conversation about this on Al Jazeera that just I thought was brilliant. David Hearst was the editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye, a publication that keeps track of what's going on in the Middle East. MiddleEastEye.net is the website, EYE. And it was just, it so impressed me. I wanted to get him on, and he's here with us. David Hearst, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. So here we have Qatar, which is this little island, or it's not an island, it's a peninsula, nation state in the Persian Gulf. And correct me please interrupt me at any point if I get any of this wrong, that is majority Sunni Muslim. You would think that everybody likes, the other Sunni countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE, whatnot, would like that. But they 2 weeks ago, these nations blocked Al Jazeera from being broadcast in their countries. And yesterday or the day before, they're stopping flights to Qatar. They're disengaging diplomatically. Can you give us a summary of what's going on, and then I want to get into why?
Well, what's going on is they're basically laying siege to their neighbor. They've stopped the border. They've, as you said, stopped their airspace. There's a problem getting water into Qatar. There's a problem getting food into Qatar. They basically closed the land border. They've done this once before. But now it appears to be more serious, and this follows a series of fake news planted in the American press and also in the Qatari news agency. The Qatari news
in fact, there was a hack of the Qatari news agency that got this out, and this is literally fake news.
And then they planted a false speech said by Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar, but also the Emiratis paid for and organized a whole series of op-ed articles in the American press, basically all saying the same thing, that Qatar was the funder of terrorism. Of course, this is a very difficult word to use in the Middle East because one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist in the Middle East. But what really is happening here, what this is going back to, is really 2 decades of Qatar's support for pro-democracy movements, but also for Islamist, political Islam, free elections in Tunisia and Egypt. And the Gulf monarchies, the absolute monarchs, thought that all of this was directed against them, that they found the Muslim Brotherhood and democracy and elections a real threat. And they were funding the counter-revolution. They were funding a coup, the military coup in Egypt. They're also bombing Libya against, of course, or breaking all international sanctions. And they were trying also to persuade the Tunisian opposition to undermine the government, and they said no, and they've now formed a coalition. So all over the Arab world, there has been a sort of existential fight, basically, and proxy wars, basically between some very, very rich Gulf neighbors. And now it's broken out into basically open warfare. What some people in Qatar are talking about, certainly what the authorities and the Emir himself is thinking, is that this is personally directed against them. This is not a matter of negotiation. It's like they're demanding regime change.
Yeah, this is an attempt at regime change. Now, the Financial Times is reporting this morning that one of the rationales for this is that the Qataris had spent close to $1 billion to ransom basically out members of the royal family who were kidnapped in a hunting party in Iraq, and that therefore they were giving money to terrorists. This is kind of rich coming from Saudi Arabia. I don't recall any Qataris being on those planes on 9/11, for example. But in any case, but my personal take on this, and I'd love you to reality check this for me, David Hearst, because you're the expert on this, and I'm just an observer here. My personal take on it is that these autocratic kingdoms of the Sunni kingdoms of the region are offended by Al Jazeera, by the news service, which is funded by the Emir of Kuwait and the Kuwaiti or the Qatar, of Qatar and the Qatari government, and you know, as you pointed out, Al Jazeera had essentially supported, or at least reported favorably on sort of the Arab Spring, on the uprising of democracy in the Middle East and all that sort of thing, and that what they're really trying to do is shut down basically a semi-independent news source. What do you think?
I think that's entirely true. It features very, very highly on their agenda. They talked about Muslim Brotherhood media. They accused me of being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is complete nonsense. You know, we're a totally independent website. I'm also accused of being, you know, funded by Qatar. Again, complete nonsense. But that's how they basically operate. When you have independent media, okay, so Al Jazeera basically did a straight reporting job on the Arab Spring, but anyone who did that was also automatically accused of being part of it. And there was a big social media element to the uprising in Tahrir Square, and Al Jazeera performed a fantastic job, which was universally applauded in reporting the strength of feeling against Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, as he was then. And the Gulf monarchies never forgave Al Jazeera for that, but they basically said, if it can happen to Hosni Mubarak, it can happen to us. There have been several attempts to muffle Al Jazeera, and it's got to be said that Al Jazeera's coverage has changed itself under a huge amount of pressure. If you examine Al Jazeera's coverage of Yemen, which is another very, very troubled conflict, they went out of their way not to upset the Saudis.
Even though the Saudis have, you know, with their bombing campaign and whatnot, you've got 500,000 Yemenis who are starving to death right now, don't we?
Yeah, indeed, and 10,000 who have died, and the Houthis are still in Sana'a. So militarily and also in humanitarian terms, this is a total disaster. But Al Jazeera have been very careful about their coverage of Yemen, and they were extremely careful, if you saw Al Jazeera in detail, about the meeting that Donald Trump's sort of triumphal meeting with his 50 Arab leaders in Riyadh, and that was the spark for this. That was the sort of green light given to these guys to go ahead with Qatar. And that seems to be confirmed now by a series of tweets that Trump has made, in which he basically said, it's great that someone's now at last taking my advice.
Right. Donald Trump tweeted this morning, during my recent trip to the Middle East, I stated that there can no longer be funding of radical ideology. Leaders pointed to Qatar. Look, you know, in other words, hey, I was right, and yeah. Qatar is the bad guy. So is Donald Trump knowingly or unknowingly throwing in with the essentially Wahhabist and royalist Sunni Arab countries versus one that is arguably a little more democratic, if not in government, at least in media? Or is he? I mean, I don't get it.
Well, I don't think anyone gets it, because there are other messages coming from State Department, from the Pentagon. Again, they're all off the record. But you know, Reuters produced a story out of Washington. It dropped in the middle of the night here, basically saying the opposite, that they liked Qatar, that they welcomed the fact that it hosted the Taliban and Hamas. This is a quote from one U.S. official on condition of anonymity. There's a certain utility, he's quoted as saying. There's got to be a place for us to meet the Taliban. The Hamas folks have to have a place to go where they can be simultaneously isolated and talked to.
They have offices in Qatar.
Yeah, that's in Qatar. That's saying we like Qatar.
Right.
You know, irrespective of having the biggest air base there. So
right. Plus, the U.S. military air base is there.
Military air base in Al Udeid. So there are mixed signals from America at the moment. Certainly, Trump is absolutely in bed with the group of people that we're talking about that are creating so much havoc.
Yeah.
But there are other people who are much more experienced in the Middle East to say, hang on a moment, this isn't in U.S. interest. And it reminds me of, you know, the huge controversy that happened with Saddam Hussein when if you remember, 2 days before he invaded Kuwait, there was a meeting with the American ambassador, April Glaspie. And there's been a huge back and forward about what signals the American ambassador gave Saddam Hussein just before invading Kuwait.
Right, I interviewed her, and she denied telling Saddam Hussein that it was just fine to go ahead, but her denial was very carefully worded.
Indeed, and I think the same thing's happening here. I think America is giving mixed signals to a highly polarized Middle East, and mixed signals could still result in conflict.
Yeah, we're hitting a break. David Hearst, can you stick around for a little bit?
Sure.
This is a topic that as I said, I think it's wildly underreported in the United States. I think it's hugely important, and I really want to dig in with this. We're talking with David Hearst, the editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. A great news source on what's going on in the Middle East. MiddleEastEye.net is the website. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
You can also tweet David Hearst at David Hearst, Hearst, or at Middle East Eye.